Welcome to the Short Funk Podcast. I'm Tom Barbalet, and today, write your own fantasy games for your microcomputer. By the title alone, you've got to know that this is a book from the early 80s. This is a seminal book for me. This is a book that changed my life. It was a book that I didn't own at the time. It was the book that I borrowed from a friend who had it. I may have narrated previously that one of my experiences through childhood was spending more time with my friends' parents, predominantly their fathers, than with my friends. And this in large part was because I was fascinated with computers, and it was a time where parents would buy their children computers with the hope that they would become interested in programming. Typically, children did not do this, but I was someone who was fascinated by computers, fascinated with programming, and wanted to utilize every possible moment of my free time getting close to computers. And the easiest way to do this was to befriend my friends' parents, typically their fathers. Through this, I discovered write your own fantasy games. Let's just call it that for the remainder of the podcast. This was a book that translated fantasy role-playing games, an area that I had spent a good amount of my late, what would you call them, from about 8 to about 13, and translated it in a format that was intelligible to my other great love, computers. You might ask, and many people did in Australia, what was the point of creating fantasy environments? And I think it's very interesting. Let's take a step back. Let's look at science fiction, for example. Science fiction, as it exists in the US, acts as a means of a prognosis of the future, some indication of what might happen in the future, where the future might go. And my perspective was, typically as I read classical science fiction, was that science fiction portrayed a reality that was very clear. Global warming, handheld devices, possibly complete total war, a variety of points of destruction, maybe solar power. But reading science fiction gave me a pretty good projection of where the world was going to be. Reading fantasy, however, was based on another interest. It was predominantly based in history. It was based in strange narratives. It was based in notions of magic. And the one aspect of science fiction that I couldn't actually grapple with was massive computation. What did massive computation mean in the science fiction universe? For me, this was the magic of the fantasy universe. So to take these ideas and put them together, on one side, fantasy universes, and by this point I had already written fantasy games. In fact, probably by the age 10 or 11, I had maybe half a dozen games. I still have these game books that I created, very elaborate percentiles and means of using 6-sided dice, and occasionally when I got them 10-sided dice and 12-sided dice, but highly probabilistic, but also based very much on kind of mapping what I saw in the real world, in inverted commas, into these game environments. And also computers, something that interested me, something that was really my passion other than these fantasy environments, and putting these two things together was something that I probably could have done on my own. But this book brought it home in an age group where I was about 10 years old, probably 8 to 10 is when I had access to this book, and reviewed it frequently. I think it was on a 2-week loan, so I had to give it back to my friend every 2 weeks. Through this period, I developed an early set of Space Invader-like adventure games, where the Space Invader characters would go around, go through dungeons, pick up gold, all these kind of things, which was really the blueprint of write your own fantasy games. Here's another thought. My construction of Noble Ape was very much part of this whole continued narrative. When I started developing Noble Ape when I was 19, it was very much associated with the stuff that I had developed previously, utilizing all of it. The original manuals for Noble Ape catalogue this very well in a broad tree diagram that shows all the little bits of software that I'd written, all leading towards this apex of Noble Ape. And through this idea that actually what I was creating was a fantasy world. It wasn't a scientific simulation, it wasn't a science fiction simulation, it was a fantasy world. I added in the additional element of philosophical satire, of not taking oneself too seriously, of not creating objective points that one could acknowledge in, talking to others. The notion that Noble Ape was just a continuation of the fantasy environments that I had created both in pen and paper form and also through computers was very, very important. And I owe it all to this one book. Write your own fantasy games on your microcomputer. Sadly, I didn't have a microcomputer when I had the book, but I had plenty of fantasy games. I now own this book. About a decade ago, I decided I needed to have this book back in my library. I needed it as inspiration. I needed it so I could point to it when people talked about the various things that inspired them. And also, in stark contrast to a wide variety of my peers in the artificial life community, it was good to have a primary text that wasn't based in some way in reproducing reality or reproducing some aspect of science. Tom Barbalet in San Jose, signing out.